Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. For the better part of the last 30 years, Pokemon has been a dominant and essentially unparalleled force in pop culture. From anime to movies, books, manga, comics, music, cards, clothing, and video games, Pokemon has managed to make itself into what is seen as the most successful multimedia empire that has ever existed.
Don't you know who I am? I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
Beating out rivals, it started over 70 years before it was even a thought in Satoshi Tajiri's head. The first generation of Pokemon games released in Japan in 1996 and later came to the West. They released on the extremely popular Game Boy, developed by Game Freak and published by Nintendo. Although originally dismissed by Nintendo for being too ambitious, everyone's favorite Nintendo boy Shigeru Miyamoto showed up and was like, hey, this is a good idea. I like money, this'll make money. And boy, was he right. The core idea for Pokemon was centered around the idea of bug collecting, a rather popular pastime in Japan. This is a fact, because anime told me so. Okay, in all seriousness, I'm sure most, if not everyone, knows the origins of Pokemon at this point. So instead of covering all that stuff, let's just talk about the game, its story, the challenges, and the mechanics. I'm not going to be reviewing the newer games, I am only going to be talking about Generation 1 today, so hopefully for those who have never touched it, this is a good insight for you, or those who just haven't played it for a long time can get the itch to go back and play it, because I love Generation 1. The first generation consisted of several games, those being Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow. Green was a Japanese-only release, and Yellow was a release specially for the Game Boy Color. Many a child on the playground would have their own little groups based on what Pokemon starter you would pick, let alone what cartridge you would own.
Piece of shit! Race war!
Being a relatively simple turn-based RPG, Pokemon was many kids' first real experience with the genre. The games themselves are broken up into two key gameplay sections, that being the combat and the exploration/collection of Pokemon. The combat is basically a rock-paper-scissors approach, and it's pretty simple. Even the youngest fans can figure it out. This is done via typing. Typing affects the game in two ways. Firstly, via the Pokemon themselves, and secondly, via the moves. Using our starters as an example, we have three different types of Pokemon. We have fire, grass, and water. Fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire. So you can see the rock, paper, scissors mechanic at its core. As the game progresses, this does get a little more complicated as there's overlap with other different types and things of that nature, but for the most part, you will figure it out as you go. It's pretty obvious as to what's going to be strong against what, but it's important to note the game has some quirks and glitches that mean you might run into some sources of frustration. Nothing is game breaking, but it's important to note some moves will say they're not very effective when they are in fact. Some moves don't work the way they are originally programmed. There are plenty of little things like this, but nothing that is going to make you pull your hair out. Beyond the battle system, Pokemon is known for the tagline, gotta catch 'em all, with the idea being to catch every single Pokemon. You would typically do this by traveling around the Kanto region and trying to catch everything you could find. You will notice though, some Pokemon are missing. They are on different cartridges to what you own. So you would have to trade with other players who had different cartridges to get those Pokemon. Some Pokemon couldn't evolve without being traded. This is pretty cool because the first generation was able to introduce a lot of people to the idea of games being a more social experience rather than a solo experience. Which is great, unless you're like me and didn't have friends and someone to trade with. Or you could always buy a second Game Boy, another copy of the game, and a link cable, because God forbid anyone actually ever had one of those, and trade with yourself.
I gotta tell you, this is pretty terrific. Yeah.
I've been trading by myself a little bit too much, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, boy.
Now that we've talked about what makes up the core of the game, how does Pokemon actually get you, the player, to go out and explore? Simply by having your mother kick you out on your 10th birthday so you can go be a Pokemon trainer. After being kicked out, the player is shortly thereafter given their first Pokemon. I can't speak for everyone, but I do feel whatever Pokemon you picked first is one that you have always loved and cherished. For me, personally, I always went with Charmander because I love that little guy. Upon getting our starter, we head off into the world to complete quests, earn badges, and be the very best. Our main goal is to get all 8 badges and beat the Elite Four in order to become the Pokemon champion, while catching as many Pokemon along the way as we can. So beyond being kicked out of our home, what's the actual story for why we're trying to become champion? Other than just our character wants it. There's not really a lot of story here. Yes, there is the whole Team Rocket plot, but you don't need to be the Pokemon champion in order to deal with Team Rocket. Gen 1 was basically a game for a game's sake, not something that's typical of an RPG, considering most RPGs are known for very large and expansive stories. Whereas Pokemon is rather concise and linear. It doesn't change a lot where you have to go. Yes, the game does turn into a sandbox by the late game, and you can go where you want, when you want, how you want. Until you get to that late game, everything kind of has an order. Yes, you can do some badges out of order, but for the most part, you will still need to do all of them before you can get to the Elite Four. Clearly though, this lack of story was not a problem, because the game sold like hotcakes, with the first generation selling a total of 45 million plus copies. Considering there are 120 million Game Boys sold in total, this meant that basically 1/3 of Game Boy owners probably owned a copy of the original generation. For those of you who aren't familiar with the original Game Boy, it is important to note that it caused the first couple generations of Pokemon to have a pretty unique look. You'll notice some of the back sprites can look a little bit wonky because of this. However, it did set the tone for the next several iterations of Pokemon. Even with the release of Game Boy Color, the original 3 Pokemon, that being Red, Blue and Green, didn't become very visually appealing, at least in my book, basically only adding a simple palette swap to the area you're in. Whereas with Pokemon Yellow, since they released that post Game Boy Color, they added more color and new sprites, making the game visually more appealing. And given the limited ability of the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color, it's extremely impressive what Junichi Masuda managed to do when it came to the game's soundtrack. It has gone on to be one of the all-time greatest soundtracks ever written, basically being flawless, at least in my opinion. There is no song that doesn't fit the area that it's in. Think of the cheery palette tone theme, the anxiety-inducing battle theme, or that extremely eerie Lavender Town theme. You know, the one with the rumors about it? I think Masuda absolutely nailed his job and is basically the John Williams to a Steven Spielberg in this situation, because without him, it wouldn't be Pokemon. But even though the soundtrack, the visuals, the game itself are insanely good, what made Pokemon stand out so much was a simple little thing, and that was the rumors. Pokemon would not have been the same, especially in the first generation, without its ungodly amount of rumors and speculation. It added to an overall mythos and legend that no other game has even touched. From Mew being under the truck near the SSN, to Yoshi replacing Dragonite, to that kid's uncle working at Nintendo, to Missing Note, Pokemon has arguably had the most rumors of any game in history. Like the cards and Pokemon themselves, they were traded amongst schoolyard kids, amongst colleagues. Anyone who could get their hands on them would spread rumors. You have to remember, this is before everyone had access to the internet, meaning Generation 1 was able to do something that no other game at this point had done: create a community. The Pokemon community is why the series as a whole has managed to stay so strong even to this day, creating lifelong friendships that only a few games like WoW, COD, League and Dota have ever managed. Yes, there are other games that have done it, but I don't think anything's done it to the level of what Pokemon has. What makes Pokemon stand out from those games, however, is the fact that it is a single player game. The best example of how insanely loved Pokemon is to go back to when Pokemon Go dropped and people were out in droves. Thousands upon thousands were out enjoying the game, talking to each other, spreading rumors, and just having a great time. I don't think any other game can achieve what Pokemon has managed to achieve. And I think this is why a lot of us are willing to give the series as a whole a pass, myself included. More modern releases definitely have their issues, and sadly, things don't seem to be getting better. Hopefully they can get back on track and Pokemon can become the juggernaut that it should be. To me, Pokemon is like a childhood friend. It's there for us to reminisce about and think with a fondness that can always bring a smile back to my face. Whereas the more modern releases seem like that childhood friend has been doing a bit of meth. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it, so feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Let me know below who is your favorite Pokemon. Again, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there. Bye.